Today's story has just about everything: adventure, danger, grit, tragedy, and triumph on the Appalachian frontier. It's the story of John Donelson and his expedition through the Appalachian frontier to what's now Nashville, Tennessee, nearly 250 years ago.
So, Steve, on this one, we're talking a little bit about John Donaldson. I know that's our primary subject in this story. Would you consider him a long hunter, one of these long hunters, or more of what? Surveyor? What would you define him as in this situation?
He's more of a leader. I think he's more like that, not just somebody that goes out into the wilderness. He's wanting to take a group of settlers and take them out and establish a brand new settlement out in Middle Tennessee, basically, is what he was doing. It's a very interesting story. It's one that we have told, but it's been years ago on our audio podcast. I don't think we've told this on YouTube, so we wanted to share that with folks that are watching us here. And we also have a little bit of something else with Mr. Donaldson that's related to another famous Appalachian we'll talk about as we get into this story as well.
Okay.
Well, folks, in the winter of 1779, a group of settlers led by Mr. Donaldson were prepared to embark on a 1,000-mile river journey. Their goal? To reach the Big Salt Lick, or the French Lick as it was also called, which we know today as Nashville, the capital of Tennessee. Now, who was John Donaldson, the leader of this expedition? Well, he was already a pretty big deal in Virginia. He had been the county surveyor for Pennsylvania County from 1767 to 1779, and he even served in the House of Burgesses from 1769 to 1774. Indeed, a big deal, as I just said. Well, he came to the Holston settlements in what's now East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. And while there, he was at Fort Patrick Henry, near what's now Kingsport, Tennessee, when the Cherokee signed the Long Island of the Holston Treaty in 1777. And that treaty, Rod, opened up huge tracts of western land to settlers.
That, and not only started the legend of Long Island tea. No, I'm just joking with that, but let's go on. And with the new land, Steve, came new opportunities. So on December 22nd, 1779, Donaldson was chosen to lead a group of settlers down the Holston River. Now, they left from Fort Patrick Henry with around 30 boats, canoes, dugouts, and flatboats. These folks were heading west and chasing the promise of a new beginning. And they weren't alone. Another flotilla, led by a Captain Blackmore, set out separately from, of course, Fort Blackmore on the Clinch River. Before long, the two groups merged, creating a little river armada with about 40 boats in total. Donaldson himself was on the biggest boat, fittingly named the Adventure. Wow, what a name. On board with him were some pretty important folks. The wife and 5 children of James Robertson, who was already leading settlers overland toward Cumberland and Big Salt Lick. There was also Robert Cartwright and his family, plus Donaldson's own family, including his daughter Rachel, who, fun fact, folks, get ready, would later marry none other than, you guessed it, Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, we'll tell you a little bit more about that before the podcast is over. But let me tell you, Rod, this was no pleasure cruise. That winter, the water levels were down so low that the journey was pretty slow going. They didn't even make it to where the Holston meets the French Broad River around present-day Knoxville until March 2nd, 1780, which became a rough day for the men and women of the expedition. You see, on that day, one of the boats ran aground near Williams Island, near Knoxville, and sank. The rest of the fleet had to stop and help the passengers of that boat salvage whatever they could. Now, while everyone was busy recovering supplies, one man, named Reuben Harrison, wandered off to hunt for some food. Reuben never came back.
Well, the men fired their rifles throughout the night, hoping he'd hear them and find his way back, but nothing. By morning, they had to move on without him. But then, in a stroke of luck, they found the wayward hunter several miles downriver. Reuben was, well, he may have been cold, but he was just a chillin' on the riverbank, as we will put it right there, probably relieved to see those boats again. They pulled him aboard, and on they went. Now, their next big challenge came 6 days later, on March 8th, when they reached the Chattanooga area. That's where they encountered a Chikamonga village. Now, at first, it looked like they were going to have a friendly exchange. The Chikamonga, on shore, waved the settlers in, motioning them for, well, to come in and dock.
Yeah, Rod, but this was a setup. As a few men started to steer toward the village, a mixed-blood trader named Archie Cootie, his father was white and his mother was Cherokee, rode out in canoes to meet them. He warned the men that it was a trap. The Chickamauga were planning to ambush them. Donaldson's crew wisely heeded the warning and turned right back and went back. But the moment they did, the warriors on shore leapt into their canoes and came paddling hard toward the flotilla, weapons drawn. It was a close call. Donaldson ordered the boats to make a break for it, and with Cootie's help, they managed to outrun the Chickamauga. Unfortunately, they didn't escape unscathed. One man, a Mr. Payne, was shot and killed when his boat drifted just a bit too close to the riverbank.
And, as if the Chickamauga attack wasn't enough, the disease was also stalking the settlers. Now, when we say disease, we're talking about smallpox. One of the boats, which had 28 people aboard, was carrying smallpox. To prevent the disease from spreading, Donaldson ordered that boat to stay at the rear of the flotilla. And that decision, while it seemed logical, ended up being tragic. The smallpox boat lagged so far behind that it didn't reach the Chickamauga war party until after the main fleet had escaped. The warriors, probably thinking they'd get another shot at wiping out the settlers, attacked the boat. They killed everyone on board. Well, for this, the attackers paid a terrible price. The settlers they killed were infected, and the warriors who raided the boats contracted smallpox themselves. And according to accounts, the disease devastated their ranks.
A cruel twist of fate. Well, the Donaldson expedition pressed on, but they were not out of danger yet. When they hit a narrow stretch on the Tennessee River called the Whirl, or the Suck, they found themselves in another ambush. This time, Indians hidden on the cliffs above rained down arrows and bullets on the passing boats. It was brutal. One boat was lost in the rapids. A slave, a settler's newborn baby, and one of two men who'd been on that wrecked boat back in the area around Knoxville were all killed. The other man was captured and later executed. Finally, by March 12th, the remainder of the expedition reached Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Now, the spring rains had swollen the river, making it even more treacherous, so opposite of low water back in the wintertime. Somehow, though, luck was on their side. They made it through the dangerous rapids in just 3 hours without losing another boat.
But now, they're about to face the toughest stretch of the journey yet. By March 20th, 1780, the expedition finally reached the mouth of the Tennessee River, near what's now known as Paducah, Kentucky. These folks were utterly worn out. They'd been dealing with Indian attacks and living off whatever they could hunt or gather for nearly 3 months. And as bad as all that was, once they hit the Ohio River, they had a new challenge. Up until then, they had been floating downstream, letting the current do most of the work. But now, they had to head upstream against the current of the Ohio. With the spring flooding, it was no easy task. So here you had a ragtag fleet of flatboats, canoes, and dugouts, all packed with exhausted settlers, struggling to push their way upstream. And to be honest with you, Steve, some folks had just about had enough.
Oh, yes, indeed. Some of these men and women did give up right then and there. Instead of continuing, they decided to float down the Ohio, headed for the Mississippi River and on to Natchez, where they decided to settle. Others crossed the Ohio and put down roots in what's now Illinois. But not everyone quit. The rest of the group, still determined to reach their destination, pressed on. And on March 21st, the remaining boats left the mouth of the Tennessee and started their upstream slog on the Ohio. It took them 3 days of rowing just to cover 15 miles and get to the mouth of the Cumberland River. That tells you just how strong that current was. Mm-hmm. And with that, the final leg of their epic journey began. Now, Donaldson was nothing if not resourceful, and also, frankly, Rod, a bit tired of rowing his boat. He rigged the adventure with a homemade sail. And get this, it was made from one of his bed sheets, and it worked too.
Yeah, you've got to love that pioneer ingenuity, because with that makeshift sail, they managed to catch enough wind to give the fleet a little boost. For 3 days, they moved up the Cumberland River, living off whatever they could hunt and fish. And what they bagged wasn't the usual fare like deer or turkey. One of the more, how should we say this, unique meals they had was a large swan. Donaldson himself described it as being, quote, very delicious, end quote. Now, I don't know of anybody who's had roast swan. Have you, Steve?
No, I can honestly say I have never had roast swan, nor do I have any desire to have roast swan.
Exactly. My thoughts exactly to that point. But you've got to hand it to them, though. They were making do with whatever they could find. They also foraged wild greens along the riverbank at a spot that came to be known as Pat's Engine Patch. Now, the name came from Donaldson's slave cook, Patsy, or Pat for short, who discovered a batch of edible greens. It was a rare and much-needed bit of fresh vegetables for the tired pioneers. Then on March 31st, the flotilla had a most unexpected encounter. They ran into, of all people, Colonel Richard Henderson of the Transylvania Company. Well, when they met him, Henderson was out surveying the Virginia-North Carolina border. And Henderson gave Donaldson and his crew the latest news about the territory ahead, the lay of the land, so to speak, and what to expect, and probably a few words of encouragement.
And Rod, after that brief meeting, the flotilla kept on going. And finally, on April 24th, 1780, they reached their destination, French Lick, the site that would eventually become Nashville, Tennessee. Donaldson and his family eventually settled at a place called Clover Bottom, east of what's now downtown Nashville, but they didn't stay put for long. Indian attacks around the area, combined with a serious food shortage, forced him to pack up and move his family to Kentucky, while he remained to deal with these threats to the new community. And the family stayed there until 1785. And, Rod, this is where Donaldson's story takes a tragic turn.
Yes, it does, Steve, because in 1785, while traveling alone to rejoin his family in Kentucky, he was ambushed and shot along the banks of the Barren River. It's sad because he died there, never making it back to see his loved ones. And it was a sad end for a man who had endured so much and led so many to their new homes. But the Donaldson family still left their mark on history. As we mentioned earlier, Donaldson's daughter, Rachel, went on to marry a man while they were living in Kentucky. But that marriage turned out to be a nightmare. Yeah, I can see why. She suffered abuse at the hands of her husband and eventually fled, returning to her family in Tennessee.
And, Rod, that's where things get a bit interesting. Back in Tennessee, Rachel met a young and fiery lawyer named Andrew Jackson. They fell deeply in love with each other, and eventually Jackson proposed to her. But there was a complication. You see, word had gotten to Rachel that her husband had divorced her for abandoning him, so she went ahead and married Jackson. Soon, though, word came that her first husband's divorce hadn't actually been finalized. So, Rod, she was married to Jackson while still legally married to her husband, meaning what?
Bigamy!
Indeed. That was soon straightened out, though, when the divorce was finalized in Kentucky and Mr. and Mrs. Jackson tied the knot again to make it all legal. But that little legal mix-up haunted Jackson for the rest of his life. Whenever anyone had the audacity to bring it up, Jackson's temper would explode. In fact, it was one of the reasons he fought so many duels, at least one of them, over the insult to his beloved Rachel's honor.
Well, you can say this. His devotion to his wife, Rachel, became a driving force in his life. And an attack on her reputation was one of the few things that could push him over the edge. Not just politics, folks, but pushing him over the edge, wouldn't it, Steve?
There were a lot of things that set him off.
Oh, yeah.
To be honest. You know, his first feud, I guess you'd call it, feud or duel, let's just say duel, happened in Jonesboro, Tennessee. Right. And I don't know if I've shared that with the audience. I've shared it with you. He was practicing as a lawyer there in Jonesboro, and there was another attorney who actually was the attorney general for North Carolina, because Jonesboro is part of North Carolina at this time.
Right.
And he and Jackson were in arguing to the judge, and Jackson, being a young lawyer, was losing and was making every argument he could think of, whether they were good arguments or not. And finally, this Attorney General, Waitstill Avery was his name, Attorney General Avery just said to the judge, well, looks like Mr. Jackson needs to go back to law school with all these arguments he's making. And that set him off, so he ripped out a page from his law book and wrote, I challenge you to a duel, and threw it at him. And so they had a duel on a hill just outside of Jonesboro. But by then, things had calmed down, and they just aimed away from each other, shook hands, and went off about their merry way. So that's the first duel that Andrew Jackson had.
Wow. I sure am glad we don't do things like that today, especially with hot-headed lawyers, that get upset over the least little thing because things aren't going their way. Let's just put it that way. Gosh, well, it doesn't surprise me about Andrew Jackson, but this whole thing about Donaldson, though, is just incredible. It tells, well, the way I look at it, kind of tells the downside, the bad side to colonization, or trying to settle and trying to move west and doing all these things. And the river would have had to been down a whole lot, because if they were using flatbed boats or flat boats, man, they'd be dragging the bottom on the sandbars and dragging rocks and everything else. I'm sure they had a very, very hard time.
Well, you think about this. It took them almost as long to get from Kingsport to Knoxville as it did to get from Knoxville to Nashville by going down a river and coming back up another river. So, of course, by springtime they had floods, so they had to deal with both ends of that, both extremes when they went down through there. But they ended up making it down there, and it shows you a bit about how Nashville has some Appalachian roots. Yeah,
and here's another little bit of trivia for you, too. There is a place in Indiana also called French Lick.
Yes.
And you know who comes from there, don't you?
Who?
Larry Bird.
Oh, okay, cool.
Larry Bird, the basketball player. So I think it's kind of a coincidence that French Lick, Indiana, French Lick is what it was originally called in Nashville. But just a great story altogether, and learning about the Donaldson party and their attempt to try to make it there to Nashville and everything, and then all this other bad luck that befell them.
Indeed. And folks, that is the story of the Donaldson Expedition, an incredible journey of courage, endurance, and sacrifice that played a huge role in the early settlement of what would become Nashville, Tennessee. Another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for joining us. Now, if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on our YouTube channel. Or, heck, just do both. We don't mind. You can also give us a thumbs up and leave us a comment. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.